Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today it is Poetry Thursday, so I wanted to explore some interesting poetry from a familiar author that I've talked about on this channel before. And today's poem is all about shadows. I am referring to My Shadow by Robert Louis Stevenson. I've talked about Robert Louis Stevenson on this channel before, so I don't need to go into that great of detail. But for those who don't know, Robert Louis Stevenson was a British or a Scottish author, who lived in the 1800s. He was known for his books, his like Treasure Island, which is seen as a classic and taught in at least in Western culture pretty significantly in high schools and middle schools. And he also wrote short stories as well, which I've talked about on this channel as well. Pretty solid short stories, and then poetry too. Today's poem is actually interesting because it comes from his collection of poetry for children, and I didn't really know that like starting out, but I'm still happy that I'm reading it today because it's important to catalog all types of poetry, not just poetry for adults. So without further ado, let's talk about My Shadow. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. My shadow. I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. He is very, very like me from the heels up to the head, and I see him jump before me when I jump into my bed. The funniest thing about him is the way he likes to grow, not at all like proper children, which is always very slow. For he sometimes shoots up taller than an India rubber ball, and he sometimes gets so little that there's none of him at all. He hasn't got a notion of how children ought to play, and can only make a fool of me in every sort of way. He stays so close beside me, he's a coward, you can see. I'd think 'tis shame to stick to nursie as that shadow sticks to me. One morning, very early, before the sun was up, I rose and found the shining dew on every buttercup. But my lazy little shadow, like an errant sleepyhead, had stayed at home behind me and was fast asleep in bed. And so that was My Shadow by Robert Louis Stevenson. In terms of analysis, there's a little bit we're talking about. Even though this is a children's poem, what Robert Louis Stevenson is doing in the poem is interesting. In terms of narrative, there's not really a narrative of the poem. It's merely the narrator talking about their shadow and the silly aspects of the shadow in a way that children can understand. The lengths at which the shadow grows and how it gets smaller and smaller and how it sticks to the person. I think one of the things that that Stevenson might be getting at in this poem is the nature of how sometimes your shadow can scare you. I know when you're walking home alone at night, like I do from time to time, and you pass by like a street lamp, your shadow does weird things, and sometimes it seems to, jump ahead of you, which can be scary if you think, oh no, there's a person chasing after me at the speed at which the shadow moves forward. But that's actually not really the case. It's merely your shadow and the trick of the light. Which I'm sure, a lot of children have dealt with that sort of fear or that sort of scary moment right there. What's also interesting is how Robert Louis Stevenson is talking about this in the 1800s. They had like whale lamps and other types of oil-based lamps at the time. They didn't really have like electric lights, which certainly made shadows much more visible and whatnot. So this poem is coming from a different time period altogether, but yet it's still relatable what shadows were doing at the time. And what's also interesting about this poem is the structure of it. Robert Louis Stevenson follows an AABB sort of rhyme scheme. He rhymes me with C, and then head with bed, grow with slow, and ball with all. It's definitely a poem meant for children, but it makes the poem fun and a little bit zany in that way. So it's just interesting to read out loud. Anyway, that was My Shadow by Robert Louis Stevenson. It's a fun poem, certainly not a very complex poem, but not every poem on this channel needs to make you think deep and perplexing thoughts. But yeah, I enjoyed it. I'm going to put a link to it in the description so that you can perhaps read it and find Robert Louis Stevenson's other poems as well, as the man seems to have a big catalog of stuff to find. If you don't like his poetry, maybe you might like his short stories or even his novels. If you read this before, you simply have something to say about my poetry review here, let me know in the comments below. Would love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this author or this poem or Poetry Thursday if they don't already know about that. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and shadow-based travels. Farewell.